Okay, so now we're on to forms. This is actually a pretty big section. It's one of the most widely used add-ons of Netlify, and it's meant for what it says on the tin for form submissions. It's not a database, although it does store data. So don't try to use it as a database because it will cost you. And also, it's just not meant for that in terms of the data structure that it offers. But it's very handy for contact forms, like if you want to inquire about prices, or if you want to book a workshop or something, or leave a comment, or upload a file, for example, for claiming receipts or something like that. All of these are very good use cases for Netlify forms. So where to find out about Netlify forms? We're going to go over to the docs and head to the form section. And forms are literally adding an attribute onto a form tag. As far as regular HTML goes, I do think it's a little bit more complicated for React forms, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works in React. But in plain HTML, we can actually do this pretty easily in our demo that we've been working on. So I'm going to go over to the demo that we have. And I'm going to go over here. So right now, I have all this bunch of stuff. Actually, I'm just going to go over to the About. So let's put the forms on the About page. So you can see right now I don't have any forms. I just have a bunch of header and HTML. And then let's go over to the drop demo site. Let's see. Drop Netlify, drop demo site master. Yep. Okay. Let's go over to the forms and see that here the documentation. Here's some basic info, and there's nothing here because there's no forms activated. So what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to copy and paste this example down inside of the About Us page, and I'm going to say this is the Contact Us page because I just like to name things what they do. So I'm going to call this contact.html. And now because I have a build step from source to dist, I have to say yarn build, basically just following my own build command down in here. I covered this in the previous video. And I can now deploy. I like deploying locally and not using the continuous deployment when I'm debugging something like a form, so that I can do the builds locally and just be very, very sure what I'm building, because sometimes your static site generator might strip out some values. Here, we just really want to make sure that we have a Netlify tag. So if I refresh, I should be able to see something different. I should see the form name contact because I specified the Netlify tag, and I should see that it's got no submissions right now. So let's have a look at what it looks like on the current deployed site. I'm going to go over to the Contact Us page, and here I'm going to say hello free code camp. Obviously, you want to put validation on this before sending. Oh, well, there we go. So by default, it sends us to this thank you page, which is just a default Netlify page. And you can customize that later. We'll just show you in a separate section. But you can see over here, if you head to the form section and you head here, that you see the form submission down in here as well. Let's go ahead and attach file submissions to this form. I'm going to just duplicate this and call this file. You must have an input type of file that's the semantic HTML, and then we can just call this whatever you want, like FCC file, and we'll save that. Again, I'm going to yarn build and push using my alias for Netlify deploy. So I just changed the form, but because it's the same name, it's going to still reflect as the same form over here, and it's still reflected that, but it's got a new field here for FCC file. So let's go over here and refresh it. Form2, form at freecodecamp.com. Let's pick a file. Let's send a little image. Send that up there. Thank you, submitted. And when we refresh, we should be able to see form 2 and a link for the file that was submitted. So this is an image, but obviously it could be something else as well. Now this thank you page is kind of ugly. So let's actually change that to reflect something that reflects the look and feel of our site. And we'll head over to the project. We'll copy over this contact HTML and we'll say thank you .html. Blah, blah, blah. Thank you. Thank you. And take that out. All right. Also going to want to link to that somewhere or build that somewhere. So I will just refer to that in index.html. And then the other step, not to forget, is to add an action to the form. So I'm going to add an action, and I'm going to say, just head to the thank you page after you're done submitting. Okay, so I think that's ready. I'm going to yarn build. Again, I'm doing manual deployments because I don't want to wait for continuous deployments. I want full control over everything, so do not continuous deploy. All right, so I'm going to refresh, and I'm going to say try 3, potato, tomato, whatever. And I'm going to choose the jam reptiles image. I'm going to send that in. It's going to submit, and it's going to redirect and say thank you, right? Or you could redirect to the index page or whatever. So over here, I received the submission again. Okay, so that's all well and good. And now we have a basic working flow. The next thing you're going to want to do is probably to do something else on submission. So right now, when you're submitting your forms, you don't really know about them. They're just there, and you have to kind of check for them. You can actually opt to get an email when people submit forms to you. You can add notification. You can add Slack integrations, an email, or outgoing webhook to anything that is listening for a webhook. So that's an option as well. I should probably put that in there as one of the options. But then what I wanted to make clear is that you can also create functions that do whatever you want, including form validation. So everything here is client-side. But what if you need to do server-side form validation? Do you need a server? Obviously, the answer is no, because we're Netlify. And here's how to do it. We're going to declare a function folder down in here. I'll just call the functions folder the very imaginative name of functions. And we'll put that in, we'll create that functions folder. I actually have a Netlify dev alias for this, or template for this. So I'm going to use Netlify functions create, and I'm going to look for the submissions created template. So I'm going to let Netlify dev scaffold that out for me. So what this does, submission created, is it runs when a submission is being done, and it parses that email, and it sends stuff out. We're going to dramatically simplify this so that we can actually just try doing something with our event-triggered function, because this is what it's called. This is a special name in the docs where it just fires when people submit forms. So we're going to parse the event body and payload. We're going to console log it out. And it's going to be JSON and stringify this thing. And then we're just going to return a body that reflects some measure of success. I am going to just return something like a status code 200. And actually, I'm just going to say, OK. All right, so very, very simple function, a few lines of code. And we're just logging out what we receive, and we'll see what happens there. Okay, so now we can just Netlify deploy again. Notice I don't have to build the front end because all I'm doing is working with the functions. So now it's discovered the function and it's deploying the function as well. If you want to see the function over here, you can actually head to the function section and refresh. And you can see that there's a submission created function and there's a log for this function. So now we're going to submit another form, try number 4, same potato. We're going to submit it again, but now it's going to fire. And it might take a while, but we will actually see the logs here. So the idea is that everything that was submitted, you can actually access, including some nice metadata that you can use, and send it off to whatever other service that you're using. So here we've got a subscription newsletter thing, but this is literally as flexible as you want. You can obviously set up your own Slack integration or Twilio or whatever you can think of, just from the event of someone submitting a form for you. And obviously you still have the form data over here. So now that anyone can send in a form to your site, the immediate question is, how do we make sure that they're legit and not spam submissions? And that is the question of spam filtering. We're going to cover 3 methods. And the first one is the best because it takes no configuration. You already have it on by default. And that's Akismet filtering. And Akismet is what WordPress uses for managing anti-spam. They measure it against other ongoing spam activity and help you actively block them. It's hard to test them because it's kind of amorphous, but we can actually try with some of these hard-coded names which are guaranteed to be spam. And let's just try and submit them and see what happens. So we'll submit them over here, and when we refresh, we don't see them show up in the verified submissions because they're over in the spam submissions. And you can review them and either delete them or mark them as verified. And once they're verified, they'll show up. The next method we want to address is the Honeypot. So the Honeypot is a security method where basically tricking bots into filling out fields which humans would not see, and you can hide those fields with CSS. So we'll try this on this Honeypot field over here, and here's how you're gonna do it in the docs. But basically, if you go over to your contact form, and let's put in a Honeypot field, I'm just gonna copy and paste this field, and paste it in there. And so the idea is that this will be hidden, and we can add in a style tag, for example, dot hidden opacity 0. And then the last thing to do is to tell Netlify that this is a Honeypot field. So anything with the name bot field is a Honeypot field. So we'll just tell Netlify that. And okay. And so now we'll yarn build again and Netlify deploy. So the idea is that you have extra spam prevention enabled by Honeypot field. That's a new indication that it's on. And it's kind of hard to demo because it just works, but I'm going to try anyway. So let's actually just use the form. And here you can see the opacity 0 field. Obviously, you can move it around with CSS or shrink it or whatever. Doesn't really matter. But here, let's just say human at human, or I'm human, and human at human.com, and send that in. And we should see human at human.com show up over here. That's fantastic. And now let's actually say robot, and not totally human.com. And let's actually fill in that field we're not supposed to fill in. So the idea is that as a human, you never see this field, so you never fill it in. But as a robot, you're filling in fields indiscriminately. So I'm totally human. All right, so there's a field here, and we're gonna send that in. And let's see the network tab. And we're gonna send that in. And you can see in the post request that we sent that in the bot field, it's actually filled out. So that means that when Netlify receives it, they know that that field is supposed to be screened out. So it just doesn't even show up when you refresh. And that's one way of spam prevention via Honeypot field. It doesn't even show up in the spam submissions just because we know for sure it's spam. Great. So that's the second method. And then the third method is recaptchas. So adding a recaptcha is pretty much the same as adding a honeypot, except that it has a different method of catching spam. And this one imposes more work on humans, but has a higher chance of success of filtering out spam. So the way you do it is over here, if you scroll down to the Recaptcha section, and you literally add a Recaptcha field. So let's just add it in over here to our code. And we'll also tell the form that there is a Recaptcha field. So this is the most secure form there has ever been. We're going to build and deploy again. So when I refresh, there's a Recaptcha field. Obviously, it could be styled better, but you can kind of fill it in. And let's intentionally fail the Recaptcha. It's just not letting me through. So yeah, I can't really fake being a robot. Oh no. So it's that good that even though I'm a human trying to simulate being a robot, I just have to be good enough at computer vision to let it through. And now it's through, and I can see my own submission. And yeah, so it is a little bit more annoying, but that's Recapture for you, and you're pretty much guaranteed that it's not a robot. And that's also V2, so you should know the difference between Recapture V2 and V3. V2 is the one with the annoying picking of stuff. There is Recapture of your own settings, so you can set up your own Recapture secrets. Over here, you're using Netlify's. And Recapture V3 is the new one without image selection. It's invisible and supposed to be low friction. And you'd have to set that up yourself with JavaScript. But if you're worried about user friction, this is the way to go. So we talked about spam filtering, and I just wanted to address one of the important nuances that a lot of developers face with modern JavaScript frameworks, and that's with single-page apps. And let's just talk a little bit about how we're doing the form processing here. So when you deploy, you can actually see that here I'm doing manual deploys, but it's the same principle. I deploy from my CLI or from GitHub, whatever. And once it builds and pushes all the HTML out, there's this post-processing step that happens. And that's where the forms are detected. What Netlify is basically doing is saying, okay, out of all of these generated files, let's zoom out a little bit. Out of all these generated files in the dist folder, which of these are HTML? And it looks like this one is HTML, okay? And let's look at all of these fields and look for a foreign field with the Netlify tag, right? And then I'm just going to scan this in as a form. The problem with this is that sometimes the form doesn't exist as a single page app. So sometimes you just have like div ID equals app, and that's all you ship for create React app. So that's a common problem, and there are a number of ways to do this. So what happens in this scenario where there's no form in the HTML is that Netlify would just tell you that it hasn't detected any forms, and therefore it doesn't set up the form for you on the back end. So you need to tell Netlify that there is a form. And so what the trick is to that is that instead of this div ID app, you can basically take the app form field name and put it inside of the div ID app, and then paste it in there. And so this way, Netlify will scan the HTML and find the form name, set up the fields, and then React will come in and replace everything inside of div ID app and use its own JavaScript created elements that look exactly the same as this thing. So because this is really important for people to understand, we're actually going to go through the actions and actually do this. And just to make really, really clear how this is done so that when you run into your own single page app scenario, I don't care what framework you're using, the same principles apply. It has to exist in the final HTML, and then you can do whatever you want on the JavaScript side of things. And we'll talk about some AJAX form submissions as well. So over here, remember in our initial video, we actually replaced index.html with some JavaScript, index.js over here. I'm going to take that out and move it over to the contact form. So the contact form is now going to have the JavaScript. And the JavaScript is going to look for an ID of app and say hello from React. So let's do that. And I'm going to say ID. Actually, no, let's put this here. Div ID equals app. And we'll do close the div here. Okay, so let's start this and let's see how that works. So this will be in the HTML, but React will come in and replace everything inside div ID app. So let's head to the form. And you can see that little flash of the form, but as the JavaScript came in, now it became a React app. So the whole idea is that I have to replicate what's in here with the React stuff. So there's one version of this in here in the HTML, and then the other one inside of the form. All the classes have to be class names. So there's the form now from React, right? And if you're a Gatsby or other static site generator user, you're going to be yelling at me saying you should probably just, instead of duplicating between HTML and JavaScript, right, having the same form in both, why not just statically generate from JavaScript? I'll tell you what, I agree with you. So let's install Gatsby and see how that works. So yarn add Gatsby. And we're going to just make a very simple Gatsby page. So we'll add pages and we'll say something like my Gatsby.js, Gatsby form.js, why not? So we'll render this and we'll export this by default. We'll see what happens when we add a new script like Gatsby build or build Gatsby. You can name it whatever you like. I'm just relying on convention. So now with Gatsby installed and I have the Gatsby page set up, it's going to ignore all this HTML stuff, which is fine for me. But I have the Gatsby page set up. Let's see what it builds for me. So I ran Gatsby build, and by default, Gatsby builds to the public folder, not the dist folder. And you can change that in the Gatsby config. It's up to you. But I wanted to make sure to go through this exercise because it's important to know that, yes, you save the duplicate action from just writing in JavaScript and then letting that generate your HTML so that Netlify can scan the HTML and set up your form for you. But you do need to know some caveats. So that's why I'm here. So in the public folder, this is all the generated stuff that you're going to deploy, right? And inside a Gatsby form, it's generated an index.html. And inside that index.html, we see what we expect to see, which is a full HTML thing with all the scripts and stuff. And that's great. And the form. So Netlify can read this. But it's missing one important thing, which is a very important attribute. And if you see over here, it says hello from React. And then, but it doesn't have the, the React code because that will be hydrated later. And then it's got this form. It's got all the right fields except for one, which is going to cause you no amount of annoyance until you figure it out. So I'm here to save you that time, which is it's got the Recapture field, it's got the Honeypot field, it's got the action field, but it doesn't have the Netlify field. It's right over here. And that's because Gatsby by default strips unrecognized fields. And that's why Netlify actually recognizes both the data dash version as well as the non-data dash version. And for Gatsby and for a lot of Webpack and like Create React App and other build tools, they wanna strip away stuff that isn't going to be used as far as they know in production. So they strip away the Netlify tag. So we need to make sure that that does show up. So I'm gonna make sure I'm gonna change this to data Netlify and make it true. So, and I'll save this as my Gatsby form in my React page, and I'll rerun my build. And now when you see the generated HTML, just make sure to check that the form does show up with the right tag, and then all will be happy. All right, so we're going to switch from Gatsby issues, Gatsby and other static site generator issues. Just remember that they might strip out some stuff. And we're going to switch back to the regular single page app code because that will pretty much behave exactly the same in Gatsby or in a single page app thing like Create React App. And now let's take a look at this form and the subsequent action of redirecting to a thank you page. This may not be what we want in terms of user experience. Like let's say we submit this form and it goes in. Notice that it redirects to a different page. Here, locally, it's redirecting to the home page instead of the thank you page because that's all we serve. But that's still the point remains that maybe you want to stay on the same page. So let's talk about that. So if that's what you want, then you're going to have to submit it through JavaScript instead of a default HTML form submission. So we're in our React app, and we're going to have to write some submit handlers to handle that submission. So it will be something like const handle submit. It takes an event, and we can call event.prevent default. And the form will have a target, and the form will be the target of the event. And so the whole idea is you prevent the default submission of the form via regular HTML, and then we handle everything in JavaScript and update the state accordingly. So, for example, I can have a message that updates like that. And I'll just make this nothing. And I'll display a message, something like message. If not, I'm going to show hello from React. And then I'll just paste in some fetch boilerplate. So basically, we have to replicate all the functionality that we would typically get, and as well as grab all the names of every input field and just submit those values. For this example that I copied, it's assuming controlled values, meaning that there is some state that you can just spread into the body. But here you can also do uncontrolled React components. And I'll assume that you already know how to do those. So I'm just going to fill in the rest of it by going form.name.value. So email value. Okay, so then we'll have we'll send the submission to the endpoint, and then on success we'll navigate. If assuming we have a router library, which we don't in this setup, but assuming you have a router library, we navigate by going to the attribute of the form, which is the action. And so that's a kind of cheap way to simulate that. But here we're assuming that we want to stay on this same page after submission. So we don't actually need this navigation, and we don't need the action field as well. So I'm going to remove that just to make clear that you don't need it. So I go down to the form. This is only for the regular HTML, like after submission navigation. So I'm going to delete that, and now I'll say something like set message success. And that should refresh accordingly. Before we forget, I should also mention that this encode command is a nice little wrapper around the form data API inside of the browser. And you can also use this on the server if you want. Just look for the relevant npm package. And that just encodes things properly so that people know, so that Netlify knows it's a form. And then don't forget to wire up the submit handler. So that's all you need for wiring up the React app. And so locally, we don't have the form endpoint at the back. So we can't really test it that much apart from just sending it in and then seeing that there's an error because it's a 404 when you post that message. But we can actually build and deploy. So when we go to the production site and try this out again, hello AJAX, ajax@potato.com, send it in. We can actually control the state of the form and stay on the same page and do everything within React, but in the back end, we can actually see the form submission come in. It says hello AJAX.